Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Zoonotic Diseases and Factory Farming session. My name is Christina Stella, and I'm a managing attorney at the Animal Legal Defense Fund. COVID-19 has shown a bright light on the issues surrounding the treatment of animals in factory farms. During this session, we will discuss three similar yet distinct issues within the factory farming industry. First, conditions within factory farms and industrial slaughterhouses. Second, government subsidies. And third, so-called depopulation methods. So now I'd like to introduce our panelists. Delcy Winders is the Assistant Clinical Professor and Clinic Director at the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School. At Lewis and Clark, Delcy leads the newly formed Animal Law Litigation Clinic, the first and only clinic in the US focused specifically on animal law litigation and on farmed animals. Delcy previously served as Vice President and Deputy General Counsel for the PETA Foundation and worked as the Director of Legal Campaigns for Farm Sanctuary. In addition to her advocacy work, Delcy is a leading animal law scholar with articles published by numerous top-ranked law-reviewed journals and op-eds published in a host of national news outlets. Galina Hale is a professor of economics at UC Santa Cruz and a research advisor at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. Previously, she was an assistant professor in the economics department of Yale University, and she has also taught a number of courses as a visiting faculty member at Stanford and UC Berkeley. Galina has recently worked on identifying the ways the financial system can mitigate climate risks and on ways economists can inform policymakers on how to make food systems more sustainable. Christine Ball-Blakely is a staff attorney at the Animal Legal Defense Fund, where she works to end the exploitation and systemic abuse of farmed animals. She employs environmental laws to hold accountable the factory farming industry and the government agencies responsible for regulating it. Before joining the Animal Legal Defense Fund, Christine was a litigator for the federal government. She graduated with high honors from the University of Tennessee College of Law, served in AmeriCorps, and worked in the nonprofit sector. So we will now begin with a presentation from Delcy.
Even as markets for plant-based and other alternatives to animal products soar, we are consuming more animals per year in the United States and in the world than ever before. Consumption of this level of animals is made possible only through factory farming, and the conditions that make raising and slaughtering such a staggering number of animals possible are exactly the same conditions that are perfect for creating increasingly virulent and increasingly fatal zoonotic diseases. COVID-19 has been and continues to be devastating. But the sad fact is we are overdue for an even more serious pandemic, one that could easily make COVID-19 look like a cakewalk. Scientists have repeatedly warned that it is not a question of if, but when the next zoonotic pandemic will occur. And there is also a question of how much more staggering the fatality rate will be than that of COVID-19. We hear a lot these days about zoonotic risks from wild animals, and we hear a lot about wet markets. But the reality is that zoonotic diseases are typically transmitted to humans through much closer animals, domesticated animals like pigs, who serve as the perfect mixing vessels for viruses, helping them to mutate and cross species lines while also becoming more virulent, meaning more readily transmissible, and also more fatal. We could not have created a more perfect system for zoonotic diseases to evolve and spread than factory farming if we had deliberately set out to do so. The very conditions that enable us to create meat on such a massive and seemingly inexpensive scale are the same conditions that make the next pandemic a matter of time. To briefly highlight those conditions, almost all of our meat, about 99%, comes from factory farms. Never mind that the package labeling may suggest otherwise. That is well over 9 billion land animals factory farmed and slaughtered in the United States each year alone. These animals are intensively raised in tight confinement, barely able to move, let alone engage in their most basic behaviors like nesting, digging, grazing, and so on. This crowded confinement alone makes disease transmission more likely. Disease can spread very quickly among animals in tight quarters, especially when they're confined amidst their own waste, amidst sick animals, and often even amongst dying or dead cage mates. Disease spreads even more quickly when animals are in conditions like these that cause their immune systems to become very weak. Then consider stocking density. Most animals on factory farms today are on sites that raise tens of thousands of animals at a single location. And in order to facilitate such tight confinement, factory farms manipulate animals genetically so that they are virtually identical, making rapid disease transmission virtually guaranteed. Add to that these animals are fed growth-promoting drugs that, among other side effects, increase stress hormone concentrations that weaken their immune systems and just increase virulence. Then, to top it all off, these animals are routinely fed antibiotics. About 80% of the antibiotics we produce are fed to farm animals. This causes increasingly antibiotic resistant diseases. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, as well as the World Health Organization, have both warned that antimicrobial resistance is reaching crisis levels. So the good news is we've already identified the myriad compounding factors that make factory farms festering cesspools for zoonotic diseases. So we just need to address it. What can we do about it? The simple, short answer is stop factory farming. Full stop. That can seem incredibly daunting, but I actually do believe it's possible. Factory farming is a relatively recent phenomenon, and we know far more than enough at this point to deem it an experiment that has utterly failed. So what role can the law play in facilitating this transformation and helping avert or at least mitigate the next pandemic? The law has played a central role in facilitating and propping up factory farming. It is only because of our laws that such an outrageously unsustainable, dangerous, and cruel industry has been able to exist, to persist, and to grow. Factory farms have benefited from legal carve-outs at every turn, carve-outs from public health laws, animal protection laws, environmental laws, and on and on. And even as we're waking up as a society to the serious dangers that we face as a result of factory farming, some of our lawmakers are working overtime to prop up factory farming and industrial slaughter even more. For example, as local governments work to seek moratoriums on factory farms, agribusiness is rushing into the state legislatures to swiftly and quietly pass laws trying to remove the rules of self-governance from local communities to make it more difficult for them to prohibit having factory farms in their backyards. And as we face ever greater zoonotic resistant risks, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has stopped conducting frontline inspections of animals who are arriving at slaughterhouses. Inspections that the agency itself had identified as, quote, the best way to detect potentially devastating diseases that may be spreading through livestock populations. Despite having said that and insisting that USDA inspectors and nobody else were qualified to conduct these inspections, the agency has now delegated them to untrained slaughterhouse workers. At the same time, that agency has pushed for faster slaughter line speeds and reduced inspector oversight of slaughter itself, further facilitating the spread and reducing the detection of zoonotic diseases. This assault on what little oversight of animal agriculture there already was can feel overwhelming and disempowering, but we cannot let it. Instead, we need to have it be a rallying cry to unite and to form and strengthen coalitions like never before. The beauty, if you'll indulge me and let me call it that, of factory farming's indiscriminate exploitation of animals, workers, the environment, consumers, and communities is that it gives us all common ground. So we are seeing groups, animal groups, environmental groups, worker groups, consumer groups come together like never before. And it's trite to say, but it's true. There is power in numbers. And we can do a lot. So what specifically should we be doing? And what should we be doing on the legal front? This is, after all, an animal law symposium. There's no one magic bullet. I wish I could say, here's the one thing we need to do. Here's how to do it. Let's do it and go home. But we need to be tackling this at every level on multiple fronts. There are an incredible number of avenues for intervention, and I don't have time to go into all of them. A lot of them are already underway. So what I want to do instead is provide some overarching guideposts for categories of legal interventions that we should be focusing on and give some specific examples of each. And I think throughout the symposium, we'll be hearing other examples of them. So this is sort of a framework for how we can think about the issue and the various legal avenues for tackling it. So the first, to go back to something I said a few minutes ago, is ending factory farming. It sounds incredibly aspirational. It sounds like a dream. But like I said, I do think it's possible. And I think that Senator Booker and Representative Ro Khanna's Farm System Reform Act, which hopefully will be reintroduced soon, provides a great roadmap towards this goal. That bill would place a federal moratorium on all new or expanded large CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations, or factory farms, as well as a phase out of existing CAFOs. It includes $100 billion in buyouts for producers who want to transition away from factory farming, as well as a number of other legal mechanisms. There are also similar efforts happening at the state and local level. To give just one example, here in Oregon, where I am, there's a mega dairy moratorium bill pending in the state legislature, and it has garnered tremendous grassroots support. So we absolutely need to support legal efforts like this on the federal, state, and local level if we're going to effectively mitigate our risks of the next pandemic. This includes preventing more factory farms and phasing out those that already exist by facilitating their transition to other industries. Of course, this isn't something that we're going to see overnight, but we need to continue working on this. The next category of interventions I want to talk about falls short of ending factory farming, but has significant potential for helping mitigate the zoonotic risks while also edging us away from factory farming more gradually. And that is pushing for laws that directly address the specific conditions of factory farming that make zoonotic risks so great. For example, reducing animal density. We've already made significant progress towards that, with more than a dozen states having enacted laws that ban the cruelest forms of factory farming confinement, egg-laying hens being held in battery cages, breeding pigs kept in gestation crates, and veal calves being kept in veal crates. So as we see more and more states banning those practices and banning the sale of products made using those practices, we're going to see a reduction in density, and we need to continue building on those important legislative precedents. It's also imperative and long overdue to push for legislation that prohibits the subtherapeutic use of antibiotics in farmed animals. This will help curb the looming antimicrobial crisis that is threatening us, and it will also make it more difficult for factory farms to confine animals in the very conditions that give rise to zoonotic diseases. The same goes for growth-promoting drugs that increase both susceptibility and virulence of zoonotic diseases. Indeed, many countries have already banned the use of such drugs, such as ractopamine, which is still widely used in the United States. So the next category of interventions is less direct, but it is just as important, and that is identifying and correcting the myriad legal mechanisms that are in place to allow factory farms to externalize their costs and to continue to exist despite being incredibly unsustainable and posing such serious zoonotic risks. This includes, of course, traditional subsidies, the billions and billions of dollars that we just hand out to factory farms every year. But also, just as importantly, it includes the myriad carve-outs from our laws at every level: state, federal, local, animal protection, environmental, worker, consumer. We need to identify all of the ways that factory farms have been able to get around our laws and not comply with things that every other industry is required to do. A lot of this work is going to need to be legislative, but there are also significant litigation and regulatory opportunities, especially to challenge some of the very recent dismantling of our few laws that did still provide some oversight of the animal industrial complex. To give one example, the Animal Legal Defense Fund and many other groups are involved in litigation challenging recent efforts to dismantle the National Environmental Policy Act regulatory scheme. In addition, the Animal Law Litigation Clinic, which I direct, is currently representing a coalition that includes the Animal Legal Defense Fund, as well as 6 other animal and environmental protection groups challenging the USDA's deregulation of pig slaughter, which the USDA determined would facilitate the factory farming of and slaughter of about 11.5 million more pigs annually, thus further entrenching factory farming while also increasing zoonotic risks by reducing oversight at slaughterhouses. It's really critical that we challenge these assaults on what little oversight was already in place to prevent an already dire situation from getting even worse. And there are really great opportunities for coalition work in this space. Last but not least, we need to identify opportunities to leverage laws that have already been enacted, some of them many years ago, yet are going disregarded. To give you just one example, it's a very apt example. Nearly 2 decades ago, Congress amended the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, directing the U.S. Department of Agriculture to study and report on non-ambulatory livestock, farmed animals who are too sick or injured to stand or walk, and then based on those findings, to regulate those animals appropriately. We have learned through Freedom of Information requests that the USDA has completely defied that mandate. And it is also a matter of policy of the USDA to allow downed pigs to be slaughtered for human consumption. So pigs in particular are incredibly effective mixing vessels for the generation of new pandemic flu viruses. They're very susceptible to viruses from other species, including birds and humans, and they provide an opportunity for those viruses to mutate and spread across those species. Downed pigs in particular are susceptible to becoming such vectors. For example, a pork industry-funded study found that more than 50% of downed pigs were actively infected with H1N1 swine flu, which is transmissible through the air between pigs and humans and humans and pigs. And it sickened more than 60 million Americans in 2009. Fortunately, it had a relatively low fatality rate, but as these diseases mutate, their fatality rates can become greater and greater. Downed pigs have also been documented to be 16 times more likely than those who can walk to harbor antibiotic-resistant Campylobacter, a potentially fatal foodborne illness. And yet, despite these risks, like I said, the USDA continues to allow downed pigs to be slaughtered for human consumption. Every year, more than 500,000 pigs arrive unable to stand or walk at U.S. slaughterhouses, and they can go straight into our food supply. This poses zoonotic risks to slaughterhouse workers and to their communities. It's well documented that these workers have high rates of this disease, as do their spouses and others in their communities. Also to consumers through the myriad foodborne illnesses, increasingly antibiotic-resistant ones that are transmitted. But it also incentivizes the conditions that give rise to zoonoses. Pigs who are raised in crowded, stressful conditions are more likely to become non-ambulatory. Pigs who are fed the growth-promoting drug ractopamine are well documented to become non-ambulatory. So as long as the USDA allows these animals to be slaughtered for human consumption, there is very little incentive for factory farms to avoid all of these practices, all of which are directly linked to increased zoonotic disease risks. And so, on behalf of the Animal Legal Defense Fund and 6 other animal protection groups, the Animal Law Litigation Clinic is separately suing the U.S. Department of Agriculture over its failure to properly regulate downed pigs. This lawsuit alone, of course, is not going to bring down factory farming or entirely reverse our trajectory toward the next pandemic, but it will reduce zoonotic risks both at the slaughterhouse and at the factory farm. And that's significant. I really believe that every step in this direction is critical at this juncture. So just to summarize, it's really hard to overstate the pandemic risks of factory farming, and we have a huge amount of work ahead of us. But much of that work is already underway, and there are incredibly strong coalitions that have been forged and are continuing to grow to tackle that work. And to guide us in the work ahead, I've identified 4 categories of legal interventions. First, and very importantly, work aimed explicitly at ending factory farming, including through moratoria and phase-outs, including financial support to facilitate those phase-outs. Second, furthering legal efforts to directly address the factory farm conditions that make zoonotic risks so great, including stocking density and confinement, the rampant use of subtherapeutic antibiotics, and growth-promoting drugs. Third, identifying and correcting the myriad legal mechanisms in place that allow factory farms to externalize their costs and to continue to exist despite being completely unsustainable. And fourth, identifying opportunities to leverage laws that have already been enacted, some of which were enacted many years ago, even decades ago. None of these things alone will be a solution, but I am optimistic that together they can help avert a disaster. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this panel. I'm going to talk about the subsidies in animal farming, and I specifically will focus on the implicit subsidies, which relates to the topic of this conference. As everybody in this room probably knows, in this virtual room, animal-based products are way too cheap. And this chart just gives you a comparison of price per pound in the US in the retail outlets for animal-based products and for their plant-based alternatives. And you can see that by far the cheapest are chicken and egg, and it's very hard to, as you can see, to produce plant-based alternatives that could be sold at the price that low. And then similarly for the beef, if you compare the ground beef price to the cheapest price, the researchers that put together this chart have found, you see the price difference quite big. So why are animal-based products are so cheap? Well, one reason for that is that they're heavily subsidized in the US. This map shows you explicit subsidies. That information is collected by EWG nonprofit, that are actual payments from government, and they're here expressed as a share of the farm income. And the darker areas are the states where this share is highest. And what you can see is that in some states, even more than half of the farm income is due to the government payments, okay? And generally, if you look at this map, you can see that the darker areas are concentrated in the parts of the country where animal production is dominant, or where the feed for animal production, such as soy and soybeans and wheat, are produced to feed the animals. So that's where most subsidies are going. What kind of subsidies are these? So these are explicit subsidies. They're actual transfers of money from the government to the farms. One of the biggest programs that is helping animal farms is Livestock Forage Disaster Program. Between 1995 and 2020, according to EWG, over $7 billion were transferred from the government to provide insurance for the livestock forage. Similarly, there is a compensation program, there is a feed assistance, and all kind of payments that go to support livestock operations and the feed programs for the livestock. And that is not only applicable to the meat industry, it also extends to the dairy industry. As you can see, there's some milk dairy specific payments going to the farms. There are additional explicit subsidy types, and this information is from Greenfield Project. So there's just some examples. There are loans and capital. So the government provides subsidized loans for animal farms and provides capital injection for animal farms. There are research grants provided by government institutions for the improvement of efficiency in animal food production. There is assistance from the government on supporting environmental cost mitigation for animal farms. So to the extent that they are held responsible for the environmental damages they're causing, the government is providing subsidies for them to mitigate those damages. They get also disaster relief. There are programs that create profit protection for animal farms. So it's basically programs that are subsidizing farms in case their profits fall beyond certain level. They're also providing price floors. It's well known that the milk, dairy milk, in many states has a price floor so that the competition doesn't drive the price of the milk too low, and that also protects the profits of the milk producers. There's also government support in advertising. Again, you're all probably familiar with the got milk advertising that has been subsidized by the government, the state government. And there are also direct purchases of animal products from farms by the government. And there are direct purchases of animal feed products from farms by the government, also designed to keep the prices high and profits protected. Explicit subsidies are kind of something that relatively easy to measure. Information about these subsidies is not so easy to come by, but it's generally in the public domain. And theoretically, at least, that information is could be visible to public. What's not visible to public is what's called implicit subsidies. Those arise as a result of externalities, the cost that animal agriculture is imposing on society and the earth and the animals that the producers are not paying for. According to David Robinson in his book Metanomics, for every $1 of animal products sold, the animal food system imposes additional $2 in hidden costs to taxpayers. And that's not even accounting for animal suffering. Okay, so what would be the examples of implicit subsidies? First, all the inputs that go into the animal production are generally not fairly priced. So if you think about the use of land and water and energy, and the pollution of the land and water, and the pollution of the air because of the use of energy or directly by factory farms, any damage that is done outside of the farms is not priced in to the cost of what the farms are paying. More directly also, there are water subsidies and the water rights in many states that are generally favoring animal agriculture. As I already mentioned, there is environmental costs that the animal farms are not penalized for. And via greenhouse gas emissions, both CO2 and methane, and then the nitrous oxide that's used due to use of fertilizers in the feed industry, that's very heavy use. Those greenhouse gas emissions are causing climate change, and animal farms are not paying anything for that. And so there is a direct environmental cost coming from animal farms themselves, but also from the feed production that also need to be taken into account. Other examples, and this is not an exhaustive list, this is just some examples that are very prominent, would be human suffering. The working conditions and resulting social costs related to animal farms are something that animal producers are not held responsible for. They're not paying for this. There are emotional costs associated with working at factory farms that workers are not compensated for. And the animal producers are not paying for medical costs related to any resulting mental and physical illnesses. And as we are discussing at this conference, there is no penalty for cases when we have a pathogen disease transmission from animals to humans, like we had many cases in the last decades. The animal farms are not held responsible when this happens. Animal suffering, of course, is another form of implicit subsidy. Animal farms are not held responsible for the suffering they're causing. In fact, a lot of those efficiency improvement programs that are subsidized by the government, they tend to be associated with worsening of the conditions in which animals are being held and the way they're being treated. So all of these are examples of implicit subsidies. Not all of them are counted into this $2 of hidden costs on taxpayers. Some of them are just not accounted at all. And there is not that much work actually goes to, not much research goes into the studies of human suffering that animal agriculture is causing, and still insufficient research into how much animal suffering is being caused. So what can we do about this? All these factors result into animal-based food being too cheap compared to the plant-based food. So things we can do, we can fight against explicit subsidies of all types, and that can be done, of course, through direct lobbying. This also could be done by supporting politicians that are against animal farm subsidies, and that needs to be done at a low level. So promising politicians that might be running for low-level offices, state legislatures, mayor offices and things like that, if they have a good promise and if they're on our side, they can be supported early on. So by the time they get to Washington, D.C., they are ready to lobby on our behalf against those subsidies. Externalities, those implicit subsidies, could be internalized to animal food producers via lawsuits and policies. If labor practices that are causing human suffering in animal factory farms, if those are penalized, then the producers have to pay for them. So that externality becomes internal to the producer. So that's an example of internalizing externalities. The fines and the fees for pathogen transmission make those farms responsible for causing disease outbreaks. Putting some price on emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and other environmental costs in conjunction with fighting against the subsidies for the cleanups, make the farms pay themselves for those cleanups if you want to increase the costs of production of animals. Of course, cleanups are important, so that may be not the best way to raise the cost of production. And very importantly, internalizing animal welfare is one way to raise the cost of production. And the examples I can give you, the California Prop 2 and Prop 12 that passed in California and increased the size of the cage that for chickens and for other animals. That is marginally improving animal welfare, obviously, because it's increasing the size of confinement for the animals. But it has been shown that because it's increasing the cost of production, because you now need more space to produce the same amount of output, it actually translates into increase in retail price of eggs in particular for the older proposition, and reducing the sales of those eggs in California. So there is an impact of animal welfare regulation on the cost of production. So more of this could be done across more states. Another avenue that also kind of a new thing that has not received much attention is that if you look at the governmental and non-governmental grants to improvement of agricultural efficiency, a lot of this goes into the animal agriculture and very little of this goes to what becomes inputs for plant-based alternatives to animal products, such as pulses, for example. Except for soy, there is very little grants for improving efficiency in beans and peas and things like that. So advocating for fair treatment of all crops and commodities by the government and NGOs seems to be kind of a not very controversial goal, but it will help level the playing field between animal production and plant production. So I want to add a little bit of an economic model if people want to put up with me for about 4 minutes. So why is that so important to keep to raise the cost of producing animal-based food products? Think about some specific animal-based food product, whatever is your least favorite, right? And there is a supply, so we have a price here and we have a quantity here, and the supply increases with the price. The more people pay, the more producers would want to produce. And the demand decreases with the price. The more expensive is the product, the less people would be willing to pay for that. And so in equilibrium, the quantity Q1 would be produced, okay? So now if we raise the cost of producing animal product, then at any quantity we have, the price at which the farms are willing to sell that product is going to be higher. Okay, so intersection with demand now is going to be at higher price and lower quantity. And so that's what happened with the cost of chicken eggs. You needed to have larger cages for chicken. It became more costly to produce a dozen of eggs. At that price, fewer people are buying eggs. So you have quantity going down and prices going up. Now, is this a more important thing to do than, say, consumer education and advocacy? An economist's answer to this would be, it's just as important to do. Why? Because here, the quantity of animal food-based food product has come down from Q1 to Q2. But if we can also convince consumers that they should be eating more plants in their diet for their own health or for the environment or for whatever reason speaks to them, what we can do is also lower the demand so that at any given price, pick a price, the consumers now want to, at any given price, the consumers now want to buy less product. Then you're shifting the demand to the left and you're shifting the supply to the left. And so with the same increase in cost of producing animal-based food, if you combine it with consumer advocacy, you get, super additive effects. Not only, the quantity that is sold is going to go down from Q1 to Q5. Okay. And this is why an economist's answer to, should we do consumer advocacy or should we do lobbying or should we do legislative efforts? The answer is yes, and all of the above. Because the goal is to reduce the amount of animal-based products that people are buying. And the best way to do it is to increase the cost of animal-based products at the same time as you do consumer advocacy and lowering demand for animal-based products.
Good morning. I'm so happy to be here with all of you to talk about a difficult but important topic, which is depopulation and how it is a consequence of corporate consolidation and a lack of regulation in the animal agriculture industry. Before I dive in, I did want to just say briefly that opinions expressed here are personal and are not necessarily representative of those of the Animal Legal Defense Fund or the Animal Legal Defense Fund's clients. Quick roadmap. I am going to touch briefly on industrial animal agriculture basics, and that's factory farms, slaughterhouses, and then corporate consolidation. I probably won't spend very much time on factory farms and slaughterhouses because I know that the other presenters have already kind of talked about those things, but I did want to touch on them. Then I'm going to talk about COVID-19 and how it incapacitated the animal agriculture industry. That'll bring us to depopulation. And then finally, I'll discuss our petition for emergency rulemaking that we filed last August. Factory farms are industrial agriculture facilities. You may have also heard them called CAFOs, which stands for Concentrated Animal Feeding Operations. That's a regulatory term. And the general characteristics of factory farms are that they are confining hundreds or sometimes thousands of animals, and it kind of depends on the type of factory farm as to how many animals are confined in them. The feed is brought to the animals, and so they're not out grazing on hillsides or anything like that. They have very little physical space. Oftentimes, they don't even have enough space to turn around in. And many of the animals do spend their entire lives indoors, which pretty much prevents them from engaging in any of their natural behaviors. That does include social behaviors and familial behaviors. And unfortunately, they are facing mutilation, abuse, and neglect, and they have virtually no legal protections. And finally, animals live in factory farms and are confined there just until they're large enough to be sent to the slaughterhouse. And that means that they're not normally killed on factory farms. They're normally killed or slaughtered in slaughterhouses. This is the inside of a warehouse and a factory farm. The industry would call this a barn, but as you can see, it's very large. These are extremely large facilities, but despite their size, there really isn't very much room in them. As you can see, these pigs are very much kind of smushed together. They don't have a whole lot of room, so not a good place to live. So slaughterhouses are not agricultural. They are industrial facilities where animals are slaughtered for consumption. And their general characteristics are, they basically look like any other sort of factory from the outside. Animals are trucked there, usually on tractor trailers, to be killed and packaged. And they kill thousands or even millions of animals every single day, depending on the kind of slaughterhouse that it is. On top of that, they are very dangerous for workers and exploitative. And death and serious injuries, mental and physical, are very common in slaughterhouses. And the workers tend to be disproportionately BIPOC, immigrants, and low-income people. This is a photo of a slaughterhouse from the outside. As you can see, it really doesn't have a lot of defining characteristics. It just looks kind of like any other factory. This is the Tyson-Waterloo slaughterhouse in Iowa, and it is a pig slaughterhouse. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So corporate consolidation is kind of an under-discussed topic when it comes to industrial animal agriculture, and it's an important topic. So these corporations are large and vertically integrated, and they dominate this industry. You may have heard of some of them: Cargill, JBS, Smithfield, Tyson. And these corporations are vertically integrated, which means that they own each piece of their supply chain, all the way from food that they feed to the animals, to the factory farms oftentimes, and the slaughterhouses. Some factory farms are owned by the corporations outright, but most of them are kind of outsourced to what are called contract growers. And these folks are kind of the gig workers of this industry. They are usually in very one-sided contracts with these vertically integrated corporations, and they don't have a lot of discretion as to how the animals are treated on the factory farms. And that's because despite who owns the factory farm, even if it is a contract grower, the corporations are still calling the shots. So they decide how much light the animals get every day, how much food they get every day, very, very detailed. So slaughterhouses are also owned by these vertically integrated corporations. And these slaughterhouses are the weakest link in the supply chain. So what this means is that there are very few slaughterhouses when compared to the number of factory farms. So you might have a large area with lots of factory farms, but only one very large slaughterhouse. And so if that one slaughterhouse goes down, that causes a lot of animals to get backed up on factory farms because they don't have anywhere to send them. And the industry brings this upon itself by using what is called a just-in-time business model. And that business model assumes that there will not be any supply chain disruptions, because that would cause animals to bottleneck on factory farms. So the just-in-time business model basically means that baby animals are being bred and shipped to factory farms just in time to replace the animals that have reached slaughter weight. And those animals have to be shipped out to slaughterhouses immediately, because when they reach that slaughter weight, they're at the maximum point that they can still fit in the slaughterhouse's equipment. And the industry wants to wait until that point so that they can squeeze every last dime out of these animals. So what happens when the slaughterhouse is shut down is, unfortunately, that creates a backlog of animals that are then pretty much useless to the industry, because they will never be able to fit in the slaughterhouse equipment going forward. And the industry doesn't want to have to keep feeding and caring for the animals to the extent that they do. So it's cheaper for them to just kill them. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So when COVID hit, we started seeing all of these headlines, and this was in April and May of last year. Lots and lots of slaughterhouses started shutting down because they were just overrun with COVID. So they were COVID hotspots, and the reason why is that they have very cramped working conditions, which means that the workers are standing shoulder to shoulder to each other. They really don't have any room to practice social distancing. They don't really have enough PPE. They don't have paid sick leave oftentimes. They're not testing the workers enough. There's no information or transparency about outbreaks at these sorts of facilities. The industry wants to hide it not only from the public, but also from the workers themselves. And there's also, unfortunately, a lack of legally mandated measures to protect workers in slaughterhouses from COVID-19 infection. As a result of all of these issues, there are COVID-19 hotspots in slaughterhouses all across the country. This is kind of still going on, though it has slowed as the infection rates have dropped. But there are 572 slaughterhouses that have reported COVID-19 cases to date. Almost 60,000 slaughterhouse workers were infected with COVID-19. And this represents nearly a third of all slaughterhouse workers. 291 of those slaughterhouse workers, unfortunately, have died from COVID. So this is a photo of the inside of a slaughterhouse. As you can see, these workers are standing literally shoulder to shoulder. They have very little room. They're just kind of at their small little workstation. They've hung these like little tiny dividers between them, probably better than nothing, but not a whole lot better. And also, it's worth noting that the common areas are just as bad. So they're working on the line right now, but if they go to the break room or the bathroom, those facilities also don't really have room for social distancing. These facilities are created with efficiency and profit in mind, so it's very, very hard for workers to maintain proper social distancing. The Food and Environment Reporting Network created this map. I highly recommend that website. It's a fantastic source if you're interested in the data. But each of these red dots does represent a slaughterhouse that had a COVID outbreak. And so this is to date, so it's over the past year or so. But the size of the circle kind of indicates how bad the outbreak was. So I'd like to draw your attention to the biggest circle. It's kind of in the middle there in the Midwest. You can barely see it because there are others kind of on top of it. But that is that slaughterhouse that I showed you in Iowa, in Waterloo. That's a Tyson slaughterhouse. It had 1,500 COVID cases and 8 workers died. So as you can see, this is spread all the way across the country. It impacted virtually the entire country and caused a lot of serious issues. Okay, so tough stuff. I'm going to be talking about depopulation. I did want to give a content warning before I dived into that, just because it is very upsetting. It is severe animal cruelty, and I'm going to be talking about it for the next couple of minutes. I did avoid the use of graphic imagery, but I mean, depopulation as a concept is really disturbing, and so I just wanted to give folks a heads up before I dive into that. So after we saw the headlines of all of the slaughterhouses closing, it quickly followed on the heels of that. Depopulation started popping up in the headlines next, and that's because as the slaughterhouses closed, the factory farms started to get backlogs of animals. So you'll see in these news articles, some of them are using, different words. We see at the top there that, they're using the word depopulate. The next one, they're using culled. The next one, they're using mass extermination. And I think that one is the best descriptor of what we're talking about here. Depopulation is basically a euphemism. It's a nice word that we use to try to not think about what is really happening. So this is mass animal killing on factory farms. And recall, this is unusual. This is not something that typically happens. In the past, it has usually been used to kill entire flocks or herds of animals as quickly as possible in order to contain disease outbreaks. So like if there is a swine flu outbreak or something like that, depopulation has been used to try to stamp out that disease. The American Veterinary Medical Association, or the AVMA, has depopulation guidelines, and those guidelines define depopulation as the rapid destruction of a population of animals in response to urgent circumstances with as much consideration given to the welfare of the animals as practicable. And one really important piece of this is the in response to urgent circumstances. So we're talking about times when, like animal disease outbreaks, it's really important to act quickly to try to contain it. So depopulation is inherently a time-sensitive concept. I want to make clear it's not euthanasia. So this is very different from euthanasia. And in fact, it's so different that the AVMA has different guidelines for euthanasia that explicitly distinguish depopulation from euthanasia. Whereas depopulation prioritizes the speed and efficiency above all else, euthanasia prioritizes animal well-being and seeks to end an animal's life in a way that minimizes or eliminates pain and distress. You may have seen this before, but euthanasia is derived as a word from the Greek terms eu, which means good, and thanatos, which means death. So it literally means a good death. Depopulation is not a good death. So you may be asking yourself at this point, why are we talking about the AVMA? Why is the government not doing something to regulate this? And I think that's a great question. So unfortunately, governments do nothing to protect farmed animals on factory farms. And this is also true in the context of depopulation. And in fact, we found that the USDA provides resources, including equipment and even personnel, to assist the industry in depopulations and in disposing of the resultant carcasses. On top of that, as if that weren't already enough, the animal agriculture industry is also raking in a lot of subsidies, and those are coming in the form of taxpayer relief dollars in the CARES Act and other legislation. And these are intended to help the industry recoup any costs that they did have to bear in order to depopulate animals. This also goes to basically reimburse them for the lost profits that they would have made from selling the animals after they slaughtered them. So this creates a perverse incentive for the industry to really just do whatever is cheapest to get rid of these animals because they know they're going to get bailed out by the government anyway. And that's a really big problem. And the AVMA, I just want to note, this is not a governmental organization. This is a private organization. It does nothing to regulate the industry or depopulation. Instead, it kind of acts as an institution that legitimizes the standard practices of the animal agriculture industry that we would consider abusive, like depopulation. And this lack of government regulation also means that the animal agriculture industry uses compliance with these depopulation guidelines as a safe harbor. So they can point to these guidelines and say, well, we did what the guidelines said, so we're good. But when you look at these guidelines, and I've just kind of spliced together some of the most pertinent parts of the guidelines. They're over 100 pages long, but if you want to read them, you can find them on the internet. So they have them organized by species and setting, and then they have 3 different kinds. So they have preferred methods, they have methods that are permitted in constrained circumstances, and then they also have methods that are not recommended. So preferred methods prioritize, these are methods that are prioritized because they should only be used when the emergencies allow it. So this corresponds to methods that are in the AVMA euthanasia guidelines, and they have adjustments for time constraints in large populations of animals like you would find on a factory farm. So what that really means is that these preferred methods are as close as they can get to the euthanasia guidelines, and they can only be used, though, when you have time to do it right, basically. So the permitted and constrained circumstances methods, which are the second column there, those are only permissible when the circumstances of the emergency preclude the use of a preferred method. Say you don't have time to do a preferred method. And that kind of would happen in a disease risk situation, a human safety situation. So that's when you would use those. And then finally, there are methods that are never recommended. And those are a last resort, according to the AVMA. And that means that you can only use these methods when the preferred methods and those that are permitted in constrained circumstances are just not available. This usually happens when the risk of doing nothing is likely to cause more animal suffering than the depopulation method itself. So an example of this would be like the warehouse with the pigs in it that I showed you. So if that warehouse suddenly collapsed on the pigs, that might be a case where the pigs are suffering so badly that the depopulation method would be better, even if it's not recommended, than just letting them suffer in the collapsed structure. So I want to talk about two different kinds of methods, and the reason why I focused on these is because this is kind of what we saw happening the most in the news articles. So there were news articles that blatantly discussed ventilation shutdown, and there were news articles that discussed water-based foam. So ventilation shutdown is never recommended under the AVMA guidelines. And this is where the factory farm shuts off the building where the animals are confined and turns off all the fans. And this causes the animals' body heat to raise the temperature inside the facility until they die from hyperthermia and hypoxia. And this is a very terrible way to die. It takes a very long time. And it's also, as you might note, very cheap. All they have to do is close up all the windows and turn off the fans and just let it go. And as I showed you in that photo, the animals are crammed in there together. So it's, it takes a while, but they can die from the heat buildup in that situation. And that's ventilation shutdown. There's also kind of a second version of ventilation shutdown that's called ventilation shutdown plus. And this is when the factory farm does all the same stuff that they would do in a ventilation shutdown, but they also use additional heat sources or CO2 to increase the temperature in the building faster. So basically the idea is that the animals won't suffer for as long. And this is permitted in constrained circumstances. And we did see it being used last spring when there was a lot of depopulation going on. And finally, water-based foam. This is where the factory farm pumps foam into the building where the animals are confined to suffocate them. And so you can, if you're so inclined, I wouldn't, but if you're so inclined, you can look up photos of this. They just run pipes into the building. They start pumping in firefighting foam is basically what it is. And it just coats the ground, covers the animals. They usually use it on like birds that are floor reared inside these facilities, and they just cover them up and then they suffocate. So believe it or not, this method under the guidelines are preferred for floor reared and confined birds. That's not true for birds kept in other situations. For example, it's not recommended for caged birds, but it is the preferred method for birds who are floor reared and confined. Okay, so I'm going to start talking about our petition, so things should get a little easier from here on out. We did file a petition for emergency rulemaking in last August, and we did so with a great coalition of our partners. As you can see there, lots of great organizations were involved. And we built this petition on two different legal authorities. The first is the First Amendment, which provides for a right to petition for redress of grievances, and then also the Administrative Procedure Act. So we had four basic requests in our petition. The first was to prevent USDA's COVID-19 relief funds, resources, and any other forms of support from facilitating or compensating for the cost of COVID-19 related animal depopulation by ventilation shutdown, including ventilation shutdown plus, or water-based foam. So first and foremost, we do not want taxpayer dollars going to facilitate this. Second, we ask that USDA withhold relief funds, resources, and other forms of support from corporations that order or permit COVID-19 related depopulation by ventilation shutdown, again, including ventilation shutdown plus, or water-based foam. And this piece is important because, as I mentioned previously, the corporations are really the ones calling the shots on factory farms. They decide how much light the animals get. They decide how much food the animals get. And they also decide whether or not the animals are depopulated. And they also decide how the animals are depopulated. And that's important because right now it's a perverse incentive for them to choose the cheapest way possible. And that's why we have this situation on our hands. There's nothing preventing these corporations from just, doing whatever it takes to protect their own profit margins. So by withholding resources and support from these corporations when they engage in this activity, we hope it would create more of an incentive to at least use the less horrible forms of depopulation. So third, we asked the USDA to create affirmative and enforceable COVID-19 related depopulation standards, at least as protective as the AVMA guidelines for the euthanasia of animals, not the depopulation of animals. And we also asked USDA to condition relief funds, resources, and other forms of support on compliance with those standards. And the reason that we did this is because in this situation, depopulation doesn't apply. If you think about it, we're not talking about a time constraint like we would have if there was a swine flu outbreak or something like that. This is just a supply chain disruption that the industry created with its own business practices. So it really doesn't make sense for them to be able to use depopulation at all under these circumstances. And if they're going to kill animals on factory farms, they should be forced to do so with euthanasia standards, since they have time. It's not like there's a time constraint. Finally, we asked that USDA establish an online database of recipients of USDA COVID-19 relief funds, resources, and any other forms of support, and report COVID-19 related depopulations. So right now, if you wanted to find out where depopulations are occurring or have occurred, you would have a very difficult time. The industry has gotten very good at hiding this activity because they know that it is not a good look for them. So it would be very helpful if everybody could know where it was happening. You would want to know if you were living next to a factory farm that was doing this, and especially if they were also disposing of bodies next to your house or something like that. That could cause groundwater pollution and lots of other environmental impacts that people deserve to know about and have a right to know about. So there was also a large aspect of transparency that we included in this petition. So in our argument and reasoning, we focused obviously first and foremost on highlighting the impacts to animals. And we know that millions of animals have been killed, but unfortunately we really don't know any more than that. That was in the news. I mean, we've seen it in the news that millions of animals have been killed, but we really don't know how many. And we do know also that ventilation shutdown, including ventilation shutdown plus, and water-based foam are painful and prolonged deaths. These are not good deaths. We also highlighted the impacts to humans, especially psychological impacts for workers who have to engage in this sort of activity. That's a very, very detrimental thing to have to be involved in, and it causes a lot of trauma and PTSD. And finally, we highlighted the impacts to the environment. I've already mentioned some of them. Carcass disposal issues are up there. We also talked about ventilation shutdown and how it increases ammonia in the air, and water-based foam, which uses an immense amount of water, which is extremely detrimental, particularly in water-scarce areas in the country. So next steps, I don't really know what the next steps are. We're kind of still waiting. We're waiting for the USDA to respond to our petition. We're hopeful that this will go somewhere, that they will take it up, especially with the new administration. But at this point, we're just kind of crossing our fingers. And that's it. Thank you. I hope you will email me if you have questions.
Okay, thank you so much to all of our speakers. Everyone's presentations were super informative and insightful. So thank you. I have some questions for everyone from the audience. So we'll start with Delcy. If you wouldn't mind answering or sharing your thoughts on the strategy of focusing on state versus federal policies to curtail factory farming. So some examples: financial assistance to farmers transitioning from animal farming to plant-based successors, tax incentives to alternative protein innovators, etc. And what other state actions do you see as potentially impactful?
Yes, yes, yes. I'm so glad this question was asked. So, of course, ultimately, a lot of this stuff is going to have to be addressed at the federal level because so many of the subsidies are federal. That said, there is tremendous potential on the state and local level. In other contexts of animal exploitation, we've seen huge movement coming up from the local level, maybe more than any other arena. So retail pet store bans come to mind, and traveling exotic animal bans. Those have really percolated from local ordinances, and then they're being translated into state laws. And I'm confident we're going to see them codified ultimately in federal law. And that's a really good way to sort of work our way towards ultimately changing federal law, which can take a really long time. So I think there's huge potential. And the fact that there is no federal law governing on-farm treatment of farmed animals means that the space is wide open. We don't have any preemption concerns the way we do, perhaps in the slaughter context and in other spaces. There's nothing there to get in the way, which means the states and the local governments can do whatever they want. So, I mentioned the confinement bans. I think those are significant first steps, but I think we could absolutely build on that. We could start doing mutilation bans, laws regulating density sizes, the moratoria that I mentioned. There's so much that we could do, and it's really going to depend on the specifics of a particular local community. But I think there's tremendous opportunity in that space, and I really hope we'll see people taking advantage of it more.
Absolutely. Christine or Galina, anything you want to add? Can move on to others. Okay. So for Galina, even if we level the playing field between producers of plant-based products and animal products, it seems that the widespread price fixing and other antitrust activity by animal agribusiness will still pose significant hurdles. Can you speak to that a bit?
So I think I would think of that as another implicit subsidy that the animal ag is benefiting from. The fact, and it's not just animal ag, it's also, monoculture companies and things like that. There is a lot of activity in agriculture that should be subject to antitrust regulation, but is not. And I think the Department of Justice is supposed to oversee this, I think, for any industry, and non-enforcement of this regulation for ag, especially animal ag, is one of the ways in which the government implicitly subsidizing the animal ag and allowing them to make higher profits than they would have otherwise. So absolutely, that's one of the targets, I would say, for lobbying, advocacy, and legal action.
Thank you. For Christine, aside from the USDA, what other regulatory agencies are responsible for the oversight of CAFOs and slaughterhouses? And do any of these agencies require record keeping or make the information publicly available?
That's a great question. I wish that I had a more satisfactory answer, but the truth is that it's pretty patchworky. So you can get information from state agencies, particularly with environmental regulations. The EPA has delegated authority to regulate this industry to states under some circumstances. So you can sometimes get that info from states, but there's a lot of capture going on, agency capture at the federal and the state level. So it's kind of tough to get information that you're looking for sometimes. Even when you submit, say, like a public records request or something like that, oftentimes it will be just filled with redactions to make sure that you can't find out the exact location of CAFO, how many animals have been there, a lot of details that you might want, but you can definitely look into state agencies. Sometimes you can get some interesting information from that. Other than that, APHIS, which is part of the USDA, has a lot of information as well. It's not easy to come about getting the information. It takes a long time under public records requests, but that is one way that you can do it. And then some organizations are starting to put together information. I've seen some activists come together to try and crowdsource information about CAFOs, where they are, what kind of animals they have, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of grassroots efforts to do that as well. But this industry is really just very not transparent at all. And it's very difficult to get information out of government agencies that are supposed to be regulating the industry, but in fact, they're protecting the industry. So, but that shouldn't stop anybody from trying.
Great, thank you. And actually leads into a few more questions that just came in. So one of them is, in terms of the role of the government, what do you think are some of the biggest research gaps in this space at the moment? Maybe Galina could take that, or Delcy?
So I can only speak about economic research because that's what I'm familiar with. So maybe I'll let other panelists to talk about other areas, but I think this issue of data availability is a big hurdle in terms of conducting any kind of data-based analysis, because it's very hard to come up with the data. So as Christine said, there are some grassroots efforts. There are some micro level studies, but there is very little that kind of can speak to the big issues that I mentioned in my presentation and other speakers as well. So it pretty much, any impact on, of particular interest to me is a social impact of CAFOs on their neighboring communities. Environmental impact, I think, is a little bit better studied because of the, in environmental agricultural economics, that's more of a focus. The social aspect, the animal suffering aspect is definitely understudied. And, if there are people in the audience who want to put their efforts into this, that would be hugely valuable. And generally, I find in the animal welfare world, there are very few economists. So I would just say more economic research about everything is very important to have to provide an academic foundation to any claims that we make, because we know from experience, but it's hard to not have a peer-reviewed article to refer to.
And I just want to push back on the question a little bit, because research gaps or information gaps are so often deployed as a way to avoid or delay legal oversight. We have more than enough information already to regulate this industry. And it's outrageous that factory farms have no federal oversight of how animals are treated. Every other industry in our country has some sort of licensing and inspection regime. So really the big gaps for me are oversight gaps and then enforcement gaps of the laws that we do have in place that aren't being adequately enforced. And when we do address those gaps, of course, they are going to generate more information that can inform our regulatory approach and public awareness. But I think the really important gaps are in oversight and enforcement.
As a litigator, I second everything that's being said. Okay, we have time for a few more. So if anyone could speak to how veterinarians or small scale farmers and farmer organizations can support any of these efforts, where they can plug in, maybe Christine or others.
Yeah, I love this question. So there are some dissenters, I guess I would call them. So the AVMA obviously is not doing a lot for animals in the context specifically of depopulation, but just in general, there's a whole lot of issues with them. They do work hand in hand with the industry. However, there have been a couple of letters from veterinarians who are members of the AVMA who have, they've spoken out very strongly against their guidelines being used to legitimize the ways in which these animals have been, mass killed, quote unquote, depopulated. So they got quite a lot of press for their letters, which I thought was awesome. And I think that small farmers could do kind of the same thing. Taking a stand on animals is something that everybody should do, obviously, but banding together with like-minded people in their professions would be a really good start. And just trying to stand up to something that has been in the works for a really long time and is a really hard problem to overcome. But we've seen examples of it. It does happen. So that's some encouraging news.
Absolutely, thank you. Okay, and then a question I think that everyone could probably speak to, maybe we'll get everyone's thoughts. Do you think that we'll see any changes to regulatory requirements or ag policies like subsidies, depopulation, post-pandemic? So are there any lessons that we've learned kind of as a government or a society that will help us to address the threats that we are increasingly waking up to? Delcy, do you want to start?
Sure. I sure hope so. We've learned so many lessons. I mean, a lot of this is not new information to those of us who've been working on these issues for years, but the public is informed in a way that they never have been before. And the pandemic really put some of these issues into stark contrast. That said, So far, we haven't seen significant movement from the USDA under the new administration. They missed their deadline, their first deadline under the climate executive order for identifying regulatory actions that warranted review. So we need to push really, really hard. We're seeing a lot of lip service being given to climate change issues, yet animal ag, which is one of the biggest contributors, is not getting the attention it deserves. So I'm cautiously optimistic, but I think we need to be pushing really, really hard still.
So I want to second this sentiment. I'm also hopeful, but I'm not super optimistic given the, other priorities that the current administration has. And I think environmental avenue is probably the best chance for, having any kind of regulation going to animal ag. In terms of what I see as a positive movement, again, because of the environmental and climate change concerns, the NIFA, the granting arm, a research granting arm of USDA, does have some programs that are now focusing on regenerative agriculture and the orphan crops that I mentioned. So I think at least small steps in the right direction, but I think that under the umbrella of the environmental and climate change agenda, that's, I think, where the best chance is.
Yeah, I would co-sign all of that, all that's been said. I think that our job is, especially in the environmental arena, to make sure that we don't let greenwashing get even worse in this industry, because instead of making meaningful change and meaningfully regulating it, what we're seeing is the government at all levels, state and federal, are trying to repackage ag as it already exists. So instead of actually reforming the industry, they're just trying to slap a new label on it, make it look quote unquote green, and call it a day. And that is manifesting in a lot of different ways, from manure methane, which is that's been a huge area of investment from states and the federal government, unfortunately. All of these sorts of things are really just trying to greenwash an industry that simply can't exist in a way that is environmentally sustainable. And we need to challenge that and make sure that we insist upon actual meaningful regulation, not something that's going to give them another way to make profits and get even bigger and badder. But we really need to find a way to regulate them instead of giving them more incentives to expand.
Well, thank you so much. All of this is such helpful information. And I know that all of us on the call, and hopefully all of us, or on the panel, I should say, and all of us in the virtual room will keep up this work to make sure that all of these things happen. So thank you so much.